Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Okolo-sponsored How to Conduct the Perfect Interview webinar. This is the continuation of several free educational webinars we've been putting on for the last 12 months. And my name is Ray Reich. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Sales at Okolo, and I will be your moderator today. And I feel very privileged to have John Younger, the founder and CEO of Okolo, with me. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Ray. It's great to be here.
So, just by way of brief background, I come at this not as a recruiting professional, but as a 20-plus year hiring manager, having the good fortune or lack of good fortune to have to hire and fire over 1,000 employees during my
1,000 people, right?
Over the last 20 years. And what's amazing is in my 12 months here at Okolo, I've learned a lot of great techniques that had never been taught before. So, and those all came out the kind of mouth of John. So, John, could you give us a little bit about your background?
Sure. In the vein of full disclosure, I am a recovering software developer. In fact, I wrote an applicant tracking system a very long time ago. HR liked it so much they pulled me into HR, and within about 18 months, I was VP of HR, managing all the recruiting for 2 divisions of Bank of America with about 16,000 employees. Since then, I've had a recruiting agency, I've had a consulting company, and mostly I was a really frustrated hiring manager. And so all of that has culminated into today's webinar about how to conduct the perfect interview.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today. So why don't we move right into it for the audience? So what is an overview of conducting the perfect interview from your perspective?
Well, one thing, before we get into that, Ray, I just want to make sure everyone knows that on the lower right-hand side or the right-hand side of your screen, you can ask questions. Feel free to ask questions early and often. To the extent that we can, we'll answer it in line during the webinar. And if not, we'll either get it at the end of the webinar or we'll do it offline. So please feel free to ask questions. So, great question about conducting the perfect interview. You know, you think about big decisions in our lives. Big one's getting a mate, right, and getting married. Would you make that decision on an hour or two with somebody?
No, I make them go through a very mathematically scored interview process.
And you're single, right?
Exactly.
But you don't make big decisions like that in a vacuum or with such brief or limited information. If you're going to buy a house, do you do that on just an hour or two's worth of time?
No. I probably looked at 50 houses before I bought my first house.
Exactly. And yet we make hiring decisions on both sides, by the way, for the candidate and the hiring manager, based on really limited data. So it's essential that the interview itself be as effective and as meaningful as possible. In fact, one of the things I tell candidates right out of the gate is that I believe that interviews are inherently unnatural, right? We've got such a short period of time to set a foundation to make very big decisions.
In fact, there's a couple of recent statistics that really back that up. One of those from DDI says that 66% of hiring managers regret their hiring decisions based on interviews.
Two-thirds.
Two-thirds are unhappy within 6 months of their hiring decisions based on the interview process. Another interesting stat from the Risk Advisory Group is that 65% of candidates misrepresent themselves on their resume. So if you're interviewing against what's on the resume, you're interviewing against information that may be inaccurate.
Unbelievable.
In fact, I still remember this was about 12 months ago. I got the resume of someone who had taken responsibility for closing one of the largest deals in a company's history, and it was a deal that my sales organization actually had been responsible for, and this person had nothing to do with that deal.
So they didn't realize that you were the reigning executive at the time they were there, did they?
No, they didn't know that I was going to be looking at the resume at this new company.
Right.
So, anyhow.
How funny is that?
So let's go into a little bit more detail on what we're going to cover for the audience today, John.
So it starts with knowing what we're looking for, knowing what attributes are really going to be differentiating. Once we have those, preparing for the interview, constructing interview questions that are highly effective as well as distributed among the interview teams, becoming aware of your biases. And I don't know if you know this, Ray, but we all have biases.
No, like my thought that I would never hire someone who went to the University of Notre Dame. Is that a bias? Or is that just experience?
No, I think there's many people who hire only people from Notre Dame. Because Now, Ray, in the vein of full disclosure, went to Ohio State. We don't hold that against him, and clearly we believe in diversity hiring. And then, finally, when you actually get to the interview itself, making sure it's highly effective.
Ouch! I just got that. That hurt.
And what's interesting about this also, I want to highlight this, when you conduct a highly effective interview, one of the lesser-known benefits is that every single person who is being interviewed, in other words, the candidate, walks away thinking you, your team, and your company are phenomenal. And why would you want people to do that?
Well, it makes sense because I like people like me, but one of the things that we found out, we've articulated to a lot of our customers is that candidate's not just a potential employee. They're a potential referral source for other candidates and employees. They're a potential shareholder or even a potential customer of the organization.
In fact, one of the best candidate referral sources I've ever seen was from somebody we would never hire. They were just not a good cultural fit, not a good fit, but for whatever reason, he was tapped into large numbers of people who were a great fit, and we wouldn't have had those referrals had we not treated this person with care.
Yeah, well, today's about how to conduct an interview to hire that perfect candidate, but let's look at the flip side. What's the impact of hiring a bad person, or bad hire?
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that because oftentimes it's not deeply understood that 40 to 50% of many of the hires that people experience are not top performers. In fact, they're poor performers. And the impact of that on customers is tremendous, right? Have you ever called anywhere and had a customer service person who was less than customer service centric?
Oh, yeah, I've left, consumer-based companies just because of the customer service experience.
Right.
The other interesting thing about the impact of a bad hire is there's a lot of qualitative, but you can also quantify it. In fact, let's look at sales, because it's often one of the most easy functions to quantify the impact of not having a hire or a bad hire. So let's look at a enterprise-type salesperson. Typically, it will take you 3 to 4 months to identify and hire that person. It'll take at least 3 months to get them competitive, and at least another 3 months to make them highly, highly confident and competitive. So right there, I'm at 9 months just to get a salesperson to the point where they can be at 100% of quota performance. But if that's a bad hire, I then need to take another 3 months to hire the replacement and another minimum 6 months. So if you add all that up, I have 18 months of lost productivity for one bad hire in a sales organization. And think if you're at a company that's hiring 2,000 to 3,000 salespeople.
Unbelievable. So as a CEO, what you're telling me, Ray, is that if you hire half a dozen people who are the wrong kind of person, that can materially impact our ability to meet our quarterly and annual revenue goals a year away.
Direct correlation, and we haven't even got into what's the cost of vacancy. And we're not going to do that today. We've had a previous seminar with staffing.org that shows how to calculate the cost of vacancy, but today we're just talking about the cost of a bad hire. But let's look at the other side of that. Okay. What's the impact of a good hire?
You bet. So what's interesting about top performers is that they're about 3 times more productive than the average performer. Not the poor performer, the average performer.
Wow.
So if you think about that, would you rather be in a 300-person company where you got a lot of average performers, or would you rather be in a 100-person company that's moving the needle?
Yeah. In fact, one of the greatest resources I've found recently is the Netflix corporate culture. Yeah, and they talk about, they only want to hire A players. And we know it's hard to have 80, 90% A players, but they put their money where their mouth is. They will pay much greater than average industry rates, and they will actually actively encourage people to leave the organization with very generous severance if they're not an A player.
Yeah, in fact, Zappos, another company that we like to reference, actually has a policy where they want people who are really bought into the corporate culture right at the very beginning. So that's another proxy for being a top performer, somebody who really buys into the culture, buys into the philosophy, and they will actually give people right out of training, right, $2,000 to quit.
Wow, before they even had
this
one day.
This includes the hourly staff. And their whole belief is that they would rather have somebody who doesn't want to be there, really, that doesn't really buy in, take the check, go away, best of luck, and it's a lot less expensive to do that than to have somebody who's an average or less than average performer not buying into the culture.
So I think we've done a pretty good job of setting the foundation of why it's important to have a great hire. But now let's get into how do you actually conduct a perfect interview and how do you make it a repeatable and scalable process.
That's right. Get people who can push the workload, who can make sure the customer wow factor is always there, and make sure that it's going to be a great company morale. So to make the hiring repeatable, you have to prepare, right? You have to really know how to do this. This goes to, for example, having interview teams. Make sure that the team questions are divided. And we'll go into each one of these in a little bit more detail. I want to give you a high level. Make sure you have an agenda. When you think about this, would you go into an executive team meeting presentation and not have an agenda?
No, never.
Would you go to a client sales a prospect call and not have an agenda?
The answer is, of course, never. But for the audience on the phone, think about how many times you or a hiring manager you worked with says 1 or 2 minutes before the interview, "Oh, can you give me the resume?
Well, do you have one printed? Yeah.
Now, is there anything specifically you want me to cover?"
Right.
So they go into it on a very ad hoc basis,
Right.
and you're going to get out of the interview what you put into it up front.
Exactly. Using a behavioral-based process. So what does that mean?
So behavioral based, so I guess that would be asking questions to a candidate of how they have actually acted in a similar situation historically. Because the best predictor of future performance will be historical actions, correct?
That's right. So I may tell you I'm going to behave a certain way hypothetically, but if you actually dig into how I behave every day, every week, every month, or within that specific function, my actions will be far more accurate than my hypothetical responses. Consistency and follow-up. Right? I know firsthand, I talked to a person who had applied to a major clothing company. And because they were completely ignored in the follow-up, they won't even shop there anymore. So another key piece of not only making hiring, quality hiring repeatable, but also building a more impactful brand, a positive, is to get back to people.
Yeah, and that's very important. And it's not, the interview doesn't start in the in-person process. The interview starts when the person applies.
Right.
So make sure you have a process in place that for every applicant, that they're notified of what's going on in the process. And then, and about 94% of applicants today online never hear back, but more importantly is once a person has invested the time to come to an in-person interview and you've invested yours and your team's time, make sure you follow up with that candidate. Even if they're not a great fit, make sure you give them the courtesy of following up, because guess what? They might still be a great referral source for the perfect candidate down the road.
Or shareholder, or future hire. And by the way, silence is a key piece of the equation. Oftentimes, interviewers talk too much. I know it's hard to believe, but oftentimes, if you have a more difficult question that you pose to the candidate, and they don't answer it right away, literally give it 20 seconds, which is going to seem like an eternity, and you will get the information that they simply wouldn't otherwise share with you.
It's a tried and true process we've used in sales for generations, quite frankly. Once you ask for the business, shut up.
Right? It's hard for some people to do that.
He or she who speaks first loses.
Right.
And it applies to interviewing.
And the positive spin to that is by giving people a time to think about their response, the depth and breadth of that response will oftentimes be far more meaningful and aligned to what you're really seeking in that root data.
And John, what's this concept of get to the underlying reasons?
So in one respect, you want to get to what people did, and you can see it on the resume, but we'll show you some techniques about getting to why they chose the decisions they did. In other words, what was their thinking process that goes well beyond what they did and into why they did it.
Okay. Well, let's get into some very specific detail for the audience now. And first of all, preparing for the interview.
You know, preparing for the interview starts with understanding the role to be filled right at the very beginning. Isn't that interesting?
Well, this is even when you probably say, I need to hire. So
That's
getting
right.
the rec approved, you got to know what's
That's right.
the pain.
Before you
what are
even
trying to
start
solve?
looking to fill the job, the interview prep starts with asking these core questions. What's the pain? In other words, why is the job open? What needs to get done by when? How will this be quantitatively measured to know you have a top performer? What are the attributes of the people on your team you love to work with? And finally, why would the right person want your job? So it's not enough to say you have a job. You think about this almost at a cocktail level discussion where here's why, Ray, you're going to love this job. So once you get to these answers, now we're going to develop some structure around the interview process that will be the most meaningful in differentiating those that you want to bring in and hire and those that you do not.
In fact, that's one of the reasons at Acola we really are so focused on identifying these questions and answering these questions right up front when you're first marketing the job.
That's
So
right.
whether you're using online job boards or use social media connections, etc., you want to emotionally and aspirationally engage that interview candidate even before they come in for the interview.
You know, in fact, one of the techniques that we use regularly in extracting these, we write that personal communication, the marketing piece, and the corresponding interview questions, almost like dating, if you will. So it's not we're looking for a Java developer. You must have 3 years of experience in this and 4 years of experience in that, because at the end of the day, that's not going to get the right person fired up about it. We'll actually take the answers to these questions and articulate in a way that's inherently compelling. And then you can start to get to interview questions that speak to, give me an example of where you used green threads and what the impact was negatively or positively.
Kind of that behavioral-based questions.
That's right.
And I think one of the key takeaways from this phase of conducting a perfect interview, don't just leave this to your HR professionals. The hiring manager needs to be actively engaged in really answering these questions so it can be portrayed for all the members of the interview team, not just the HR interview or just the hiring manager.
That's right.
So now once you've prepared for the interview, let's talk about how to really effectively manage that hour-long interview.
So there are a couple tenets that if you follow will make your interviewing far more effective. First is have a rating system. It doesn't need to be complicated. This doesn't need to be something you have to go out and buy. Think of the core attributes you identified earlier, right, in the corresponding questions, and have next to it a 4-point response. So excellent, good, fair, and poor.
Now, John, let me ask you a question here. I know we've had this question asked online. So do I use a math-based rating system, like a 1 through 5, or do I use more of that excellent, good, fair, poor? Which works best?
You can use both, and there are a couple of elements there. One is sometimes when it's straight numerically based, sometimes people stick too hard to that. In other words, they look at the quantitative number and they say, no, I'm not going to hire Ray because he's an 18, and I'm going to hire this person who's a 19. When in fact, the cultural fit for one might be vastly better, even with a lower score. So oftentimes what we recommend is go for the excellent, good, fair, and poor type scale. And a marketing guru once told me, never have 5 options.
Oh, because I can just pick the middle one.
People will wimp out and pick the middle one. Force the midpoint.
That's how I got through Ohio State multiple choice. Always answer C.
C. I was going to talk to you about that. And the other thing is, what are the personal drivers, right? So when you manage the interview, you want to have an agenda. You want to set the agenda right up front. And that's how you stay on track. An agenda that we typically use is as follows. Ray, thanks for being here. We're now I want to, get the most we can out of the interview, and I'd like to approach it the following way. First, let me ask you some questions, and I would like to learn a whole lot more about you. Second, I'll give you a better sense of what the job and the company are about. And third, I'll answer any questions you have. And I'll even ask the candidate, is that okay? Does that work for you? And they'll, of course, say, that's fine. That way you don't want to be careful not to bias their answers with things that you tell them first.
Oh, that's interesting, because I know a lot of companies will say, I want to give them an overview of the company and the position because I want to sell them on why they want to join us. You're saying just the opposite.
Absolutely.
Get to know them first.
Do not talk about the company and the role first, because great interviewers or great interviewees, great candidates, great people who know how to interview well will then manipulate the whole interview, making you think they're phenomenal. And then when they get in the role, they'll fail miserably.
And that's one of the things we'll go into a lot more detail on in a little bit later, is how to make sure you stay on track. To your point, a really good candidate, especially in some of the functions like sales, that are used to controlling the situation, will make it all about you, your kids, your dogs, etc. Right. It's not about them.
The other thing in controlling and managing the interview is understand that you're going to have a set of questions, which you've already developed, and we'll give you some information about that. And also there's a complimentary interviewer guide we'll give to everybody on the call. We'll give you the email address at the end. Is that as you navigate those questions, some people will respond and keep talking. And I mention this because sometimes they do it for being nervous, sometimes it's just their personality. What do you do if somebody keeps talking as it relates to managing the interview?
Well, I think you need to be respectful, but you also need to move them to the next question.
Yeah, so if somebody talks on and said, thank you for sharing, I realize you've got more to share, but if it's okay with you, I'd like to move on to the next question. And again, in asking them, you're also getting their buy-in. Now, I've also had some people who can keep talking even while inhaling. And I'll interrupt them exactly twice. If I have to do it a third time, guess what happens? I'll let you keep talking for the full 20 minutes. This is great, Ray. Thank you for sharing. Any questions, and I'll walk you to the door.
Well, and that's also, remember that interviewing is not a popularity contest. So they may take you down a tangent to talk about what you really are interested in, but it may have nothing to do with the job.
Right.
So make sure you don't view this as a popularity contest. So this is especially important for early career managers or first-time hiring managers. So we've talked a little bit about managing an interview. Let's kind of talk about how do you manage the interview process, and specifically if you do team-based interviews.
It's a great point of focus, Ray. One of the worst things that can happen is where a poor candidate sits in on 20 interviews. Everybody's asking ostensibly the same questions. That's the worst possible way. And by the way, that's the record so far is 21 people, one of our clients.
21 people interviewed the same candidate. How could you possibly get 21 different perspectives?
Well, and how could you possibly ever get consensus, right? And the candidates, to a person that we checked with, walked away and said, I'm not sure I want to work there.
So what do you recommend? Number one, how large should an interview team be, John?
So think of 3 interviews as the goal. 3 interviews. And typically those interviews are lumped around these 3 areas: personality, culture fit, technical skills, leadership, and management ability. Now, within each of these 3 interviews, you may have multiple people sit in on them. And I would recommend no more than 2, but if you have to, 3. So now there's 3 people sitting on one interview around technical skills rather than 3 technical interviews with all the same questions. And the goal is that the 3 people have to understand here are the 5, 6, 8, 10 questions that we need to get the answers to our satisfaction. So now it's much more guided and will likely not get off track so quickly.
Yeah. And one of the best practices we've seen is it doesn't have to be a hiring team or interview team just from the same function. You might find someone who's really good at personality and culture fit in technology, even though you're hiring for a marketing position. So leverage that person to be in there.
That's a great point. One of the working sort of assumptions that we have right now, and it's proving to be highly accurate, which is there are some people in companies who are extraordinary at interviewing, independent of their function. And that in many cases, those companies would be well served by having people like that, 3 or 4 people like that, interview everybody for every function.
The other thing that we do for our customers is we really measure not only the recruiting efficiency, but the interview efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do have team-based interviewing, don't let this spread out over 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, especially if the war for talent increases again. And by the way, in 2011, we do believe we're going to see the emergence of a new war for talent. And one of the reasons is, an example is a recent survey by Dice.
Oh, that's right. There was 51%, was it?
Of existing technology-based employees in the United States will leave their job as soon as the hiring economy turns around, and there's nothing, and I say nothing, that their current employer
So wait a minute, let me get this right. So according to the survey, 51% of our company's technology team is already planning to leave.
Exactly.
Even though we don't know it.
Right, and it's for
They're
several
just waiting
reasons.
for the opportunity.
Yeah, one might be salary, one might be an advancement opportunity. Quite frankly, what a lot of companies have done over the last 24 months with 9.6% unemployment and private sector jobs continuing to go down every month is they haven't really given raises. They haven't invested in training.
Or they've done reductions in force and therefore had asked the existing people to do more with less.
Yeah. So that's a little tangential, but once again, when you're looking at the interview team process, do not make it at the expense of speed and accuracy.
And one last thing on the interview teams. We had one client, Ray, where the sales team was having a tremendously high turnover rate, and they just kept pushing for more and more candidates. We just need more and more to come in and interview. And what we found, once they engaged us, is that they were being deliberately belligerent and rude to the candidates when they came in to interview.
Why is that?
Well, that's what I asked. Like, what are you doing? So I want to see how the VP of sales himself said, we want to see how people function under stress. So by nature of being rude to them, we're putting them under stress. And we gently, in some ways not so gently, said, you're actually pushing away the top performers and everybody they know, because now the reputation for your company is don't work there. Don't even interview there.
So think about it. That VP of sales probably wanted that elusive passive candidate, the person who was employed, the person who was an A performer, and then made it a very, what's the right word, very difficult environment even to want to be in.
Right. And so not only did they not create an environment where they could get the right people excited about it, they pushed everyone away so those people won't even be customers of that company.
Well, let's move away from the team-based interviewing and really talk about How do you identify some of the top performers from non-experiential basis?
Well, it's interesting. I distilled it down to 3 characteristics across every function. That seems like a tall order. Are there really 3 things that everybody would align to? And what we found is yes. Now, again, this doesn't take the place of the functional expertise required in a particular role, but we found that if we find drive, curiosity, and ethics at a sufficiently high level with an individual, that makes them a high probability of a hire if they have close enough functional skill.
Well, we see here drives around self-motivation, loves winning, achieving goals. What would be some examples of a person's background that would say they're driven?
Great question. So people who are driven in the work world and in their personal lives. So even an intern or a new college grad, you'll see drive manifested in things like being on the debate club, being on the rowing team, being a captain of some function. Could be somebody who worked a couple jobs during school to pay for school. There are people who find ways to simply put their shoulder behind whatever they want to achieve and make a point of achieving it.
Okay. And how about curiosity?
Curiosity is a really interesting one. This is one that I find fascinating. So we've found that curiosity is a fabulous proxy for both IQ and humility, right? Because somebody who's highly curious has to start with the assumption I don't know everything, right? And also, they tend to be the people we found who are exceptional problem solvers because they step back and go, well, gee, how would I solve that? What is the problem? Why is that? What's the root cause? Curious about the field. And if they're in a particular domain, the people we like to hire, like in the technology development area, aren't the people who are good at coding X number of lines of code. They're the people who are asking the question, how can I make my code better today than it was yesterday?
And what's really interesting about curiosity, of course, you can't discriminate based on someone's age. But we know that sometimes with someone with 20 or 25 years of experience, they may not be open to new ideas. But a way to really test that is look at, do they have the type of personality that is continuously looking to learn, always how to do different and better things.
That's right.
So, in fact, one of the ways that I test that is when I'm interviewing someone, I want to find out what they know about our company and what type of research they've done. So I say, based upon the research you've done on Ocolo, what do you think the 1 or 2 most interesting things in how we approach a market are?
Right.
And I use silence.
Or don't you also reference things that you know a lot about, even outside of work?
Yeah, it's funny. I do, but I don't really use that to help identify the curiosity attribute, but I really use that almost integrity-based.
For the ethics piece.
Yeah, because what I like to do is say, one of the things I've spent a lot of time on in my career is e-commerce.
Right.
So when I was in e-commerce companies, I would say, so what do you think's created the evolution of e-commerce to the mobile space? And how do you think it will evolve over the next 12 to 24 months? Now, a candidate who knows a lot will like talking about it, and I can validate because that's one of my areas of expertise. But on the flip side, I have more than 60% of candidates will talk about the evolution of e-commerce to mobile commerce, and they really have no basis for what they're saying.
Right.
So it tells me, well, this person will just try to tell me what he thinks I want to hear versus what he really knows.
Exactly.
And in fact, the candidate says, I don't have as much experience there, but here's some of the research I've done. Let me tell you what I've
Or here's a correlation of another area that I didn't know a lot about and how I addressed it.
So drive, curiosity, and ethics. Now, one of the questions a lot of people ask us is, well, what do you think about doing kind of psychographic assessment testing, John, especially for early stage employees? What's your experience with assessment testing?
Assessment testing, we found can be valuable, but I would look at that as a later stage element of the equation. One, because it's going to become prohibitively expensive if you try to do it with all applicants. And two, you look at Myers-Briggs, so I'm an ENTJ. What do you do with that?
Well, once again, if I'm an ENTJ, it's like, well
great.
Here's because you're like me.
So the idea is that there's absolutely a place for some of these, and like you, I'm sure, I've taken dozens of these tests. And one of the things I've discovered is they all come back with a very similar profile. So that's good, that there's probably some validation that they will give you a pretty good insight into the person, but it's important to look at it in the context of a greater whole and not in the absence of interviews, either phone or in person, where this kind of technique can be used.
Okay. So let's move beyond some of these personality, innate behavior traits to how do you really construct meaningful and impactful interview questions?
That's great. That's a great question, Ray. So start with open-ended versus closed-end questions. Closed-end questions are those questions that can be responded to with a yes or no response. Those are some of the least effective. Open-ended questions are questions where you can get a greater depth into not only what the person you're speaking with knows about a given area, but also how they communicate and how they think. So here are a few examples. Describe a situation where, give a specific example of when, but these also will relate to the specific cultural fit, functional expertise, and overall ability to contribute to the organization.
An example, one of the ones I like to use all the time is, describe a situation where you were told that it wasn't possible to do what you wanted to do.
And what did you do? Right.
So that says, okay, and by the way, what that does is it links it back to their drive.
That's right.
Because I remember, and John, I know you have a story like this too, I was told by an athletic coach in college, you're never going to be able to do this. Just give up. Right? And that was like...
So you did, right?
No, that's when that's when the drive kicked in. It's like, no one tells me something's not possible.
Right.
Right? If I work hard enough, it's going to be possible.
Yeah, in fact, I was actively not invited to the first national rowing team camp by the coach. And same kind of thing. And I said, well, what happens if I just show up anyway? And I did, and I was very successful in that pursuit. But the point is that was a good marker that would have been hard for an interviewer to find if they hadn't asked a question like that.
And by the way, what's your opinion on, do you construct these in writing and take them in with you? Or do you just kind of go in based upon the candidate, you create these kind of on the fly? I know that's kind of an easy question, I guess. But
no, you definitely want to have questions identified in those three functional areas and for the teams ahead of time. You don't want to wing this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people who've been doing it a long time will remember the questions, so that makes it a little easier.
Mm-hmm.
But you definitely want to think through the questions, and you also want to avoid hypothetical questions. Why would you want to do that?
Because it's a hypothetical, you're not going to relate back to behavior-based experience.
Yeah, in the simplest terms, hypothetical questions get you hypothetical answers that may have no basis. Yeah, I would be a great pro basketball player. You know, how would you handle this? Oh, I'd be if you were driving down the field, I would turn the car this way and that way and, do a Dukes of Hazzard, and I'm probably dating myself right there. And, in matter of fact, I could be a lousy driver.
Well, let's move away from constructing the interview questions to how do you really analyze the answers? Because a lot of times, you get candidates who just talk about, well, here's what I think.
Or here's what I feel. That's a great segue. So the key here, Ray, is get beyond what the applicant thinks or feels, or even some basic analysis of the role, and really get to the data. And this data is really the level at which all sort of overlay or opinion is peeled back.
So can you give an example?
Sure.
Sure. Sales. How
sales
would that play out in a sales interview?
So you tell me you feel like you're the best salesperson ever, and you think you could even be better, especially in this organization. And I've had candidates say exactly those things. So how did you do in your last role? Oh, my analysis was I did better than most of the people in the company. Okay, but that still doesn't tell me how many sales did you close with annual contracts and what was the total contract value. So now when you dig into that, I had one sales guy, Ray, I have to tell you about this, where he was a self-proclaimed superstar. And unfortunately, most salespeople land somewhere in that zone, present company accepted.
I thought you said don't bring in your preconceived biases. Go ahead.
So this particular applicant, when I got to the data, and I had to push for it, he didn't want to volunteer it. When I pushed for it, what I found is that in the last 2 quarters, he hadn't closed a single deal. Now, conversely, on the flip side or on the positive side, sometimes when you talk to a developer or someone who's a little bit more shy, they don't necessarily want to share the data, right? Mm-hmm. So how many releases did you develop and release in the last 12 months?
Yeah, but John, you just hit a little point there. So you can get to data, but you can get to data that is candidate-specific, or you can get to data that maybe is more at a higher level. It's their company. It's their department. So you've always talked about getting to I when you get to the data. So
That's right.
What's this I concept?
That's great. So if you think about it, most people when they interview are less comfortable talking about what they specifically did with enough detail and data. So the dynamic of the interview is generally the candidate's trying to push it back out, and the interviewer, your job, is to push it back in. And like in teaching, the very first set of 3 or 4 questions, you will want to come out of the gate because you have limited time and drive to I. So imagine this. So I ask you, well, give me a sense of how you did in your last sales role. And you talk about what the company, the world of SaaS software is doing this, and sales are going up in general. But Ray, tell me about what you did. So this is my company did, my department, my team, and my team hit their quota over the last 4 quarters, every single quarter. So what happens if I don't accept that and I say, Ray, I appreciate that, but we're not hiring your team, we're hiring or considering hiring you. Tell me your specific contribution to each of those quarters. And even though you may be uncomfortable, if I do it tastefully and tactfully, but push to get to the I on the first question, second question, what happens when I ask you the third question?
I'm going to probably go to the, here's what I did.
Yeah, because you're going to realize that as an interviewer, I'm going to work to get to the I no matter what. So you'll start there. So what will happen is you will get more data in 20 minutes than you used to get out of 60 or 90 minutes in an interview.
So here's an example of what in marketing can happen. You're bringing them for marketing communications, which are responsible for help messaging new product launches. I had somebody come in with an entire new product introduction booklet. It had all the ad copy, it had all the data sheets, etc. And this person, it was about 50 pages. And initially, I was so impressed. But by using this technique, what I got into was this person was responsible for doing some editing and the publication of this manual, but not the content. And
right.
What I was looking for somebody who actually wrote the data sheets, who actually knew how to effectively market those and get them into the sales organization so they could use them at the right time in the sales process.
Well, it's interesting. So in that example, you were talking to the person who was a support person to the people you want to talk to.
Exactly.
So if you treat that person poorly in the interview, what happens? You won't have access to the people that person knows.
Exactly.
If you treat that person well, even to say, you know what, there's others who might be a better fit. By the way, here's what we're looking for, a little more depth here and here. You might be able to introduce me to the people who actually offer these things. They actually will if you treat them well.
So the key takeaway from this, John, is really make sure that your interview questions get into what they did and get to the I of the accomplishments, not into the we of the
And I have one at B of A I have to share with you, Ray. So I was working for Bank of America, right? It's a bank. And there was a candidate that we were interviewing. This is a college entry-level program. I was interviewing someone at Sacramento State. And this person wanted to keep things generalized and talked about what his academic was about and the program. I said, well, I want to dig a little deeper. And I noticed you came out of high school and there's a gap here of a couple of years. What happened? Oh, you know how kids are. And he just glossed over it and jumped back into the, here's what I did in school. He finally got to I, but only on the other side of starting school. I pulled him back and said, give me a little bit more information. It's still a little fuzzy here. Oh, you know how kids are. Anyway, got into school and he went back again. I literally had to pull him back 5 times. And he finally exhaled and his shoulders dropped a little bit. And he said, okay, I guess you'll probably figure this out anyway. As it turns out, he robbed banks and was in a federal penitentiary for 3.5 years.
But the good news is you were looking for banking experience.
Yeah, exactly. That's biting my lip. I want to say something. Yeah, we like people with banking experience. But there's an example that most interviewers would have missed that had that not been this dynamic of both getting to the I and getting to the data.
Yeah. So let's move to another thing that you talk a lot about in several other conversations we have. That is how do you walk through their history?
It's a great question. So here's a technique, Ray. And for those of you on the phone, on the webinar, take this note. If you follow this, you will get information that very few other interviewers will get with this strategy. So the first thing is for every single person that I interview, and I don't care what level, I don't care how many jobs they've had, has nothing to do with age, I will do this for every single job they've had, starting with why they picked their school if they have a college degree. How did you find out about the job? Simple as that. How did you hear about it?
So not just the job you're interviewing for, but for every job on the
resume. So I'll go back on the resume and I'll start with the oldest one. How did you find out about the job? And it's typically one of 3 ways. They created it, if they were entrepreneurial. They found out about it through a public source like a job board or a LinkedIn job posting, just to generalize, or they got it through someone they know. And what that tells me is over several jobs, if it's always because of a Craigslist posting or a public thing, that's not necessarily a ding, but it's not as strong as somebody who got pulled in by previous people they worked with, right? Because if they are pulled in by other people they've worked with, that's a level and a commitment of confidence that you can't fake. It also means that if we hire them, we may have access to other people that they've worked with who might be of the same high caliber. The second thing is, what attracted you to the job before you started? And oftentimes candidates will start jumping into what they did in the role, and I'll actually interrupt them and say, I really don't want to, the point of this question is I want to find out what you liked about it before you started. And what it highlights is how much depth of research they had done, what their preconceived notions were about what the job was and wasn't, what their perceptions were about the team and the hiring manager before they started, and lastly, why did you leave? And what one example showed, interviewed somebody who said, I found my job through Craigslist. I originally was attracted to this because it looked like a great opportunity to grow my skills and leverage what I like to do. Why'd you leave? It was a management issue. The next job, how'd you find it? Monster.com. What'd you like it before you started? Oh, I like the opportunity to enhance my skills. Why'd you leave? Management wasn't very good. By the fourth company, this candidate actually stopped himself and said, wow, looks like I have an issue with management, doesn't it? I said, yeah, it actually does.
Yeah. The other thing, it's interesting when you talk about how did you find out about the job, what attracted you to the job, it also can link right back to that drive and curiosity attributes that we talked about so much. So
right.
I loved it. One of the times I talked to a guy about every one of his jobs. He's like, you know, I heard about this company from a good friend. They were growing at 50%. It was in one of the most interesting new markets. It was the beginning of the internet industry or the beginning of the SaaS industry. And I picked up the phone and I called the VP of sales. I mean, I looked at the drive, the curiosity. It's like, wow, this is the type of...
So they hit, right out of the gate, they hit 2 out of 3, drive, curiosity. Now you just got to verify the ethics, and you probably have a great hire.
Exactly. And I always love, why did you leave? It's like, well, the company was bought, or, you know, they had the opportunity to make a lot of money because they got to the late market majority. They weren't making as much money.
Another example with a lot of reductions in force, some people left because of reduction in force, but I've also interviewed candidates where they were ripped every single job they'd have in the last 6 jobs. That still may be market dependent, but when there's that many times, there's probably an issue I need to at least explore a little further.
And for any of those who have had to go through RIFs, we typically don't get rid of the top 20% of our people during a RIF. Right? That's called company close down. If you do
right,
that.
exactly.
So we've talked a lot about how to ask questions, what type of questions to ask, but what about questions that you shouldn't ask?
That's a great question, right? We've actually been brought in by the EEOC to help educate them on modern recruiting techniques, and they've had an opportunity to look at our platform and our process. And one of the things I can say is that recruiting is all about discrimination.
What?
Exactly, huh? And HR people sort of wince when that's said. Recruiting is all about discrimination. The key is you have to discriminate legally, and you have to discriminate based on those elements that will differentiate top performers from the non-top performers while avoiding the things you see on the screen.
Yeah, so the discrimination is really about the attributes that are required to be successful in the job. Experience, knowledge, drive, curiosity, etc.
Yeah, fit to the culture. But avoid all the things you see on the screen, age, sex, race, etc. And in fact, have you ever had candidates who bring some of these things into the equation or into the discussion?
Oh, yeah. A lot of times, especially when in sales or marketing, oh, I see you have 3 kids. I have 2 kids also. So should I take that bait?
Absolutely not. And in fact,
they brought it up.
Right. They brought it up. So what you'd want to do as an interviewer is refocus. This goes back to managing the interview. Thanks for sharing, Ray, but I want to get back to the essential fit on the job.
But John, I feel I would be impersonal if I didn't say, oh, really? So, you have 2 kids. What ages are they? Don't do that, huh?
Yeah, don't do that. Yeah, you want to stay away from these things because it's not that you would necessarily discriminate based on those, Ray, but in the eyes of the candidate, and particularly those who aren't selected, all they need to do is find an attorney who will take the case because you talked about their kids for 20 minutes.
Ah, interesting. The other thing, so you want to be careful of discriminating against things that you can't, but you also want to be careful about positively discriminating against things based on your own personal biases, right?
We all have filters, right? Every single one of us. For example, I know people who go to Ohio State and think that it's like the end-all of schools. That's a pretty thick filter. In fact, some would say there's a certain blindness involved in that.
And typically, to be honest, it's not always what I state, but I do remember a hiring executive that if they weren't a Harvard grad, they weren't going to be hired.
We had one of those. We had one of those with a wireless company. It was a little a medium-sized wireless company who wanted to go public. And the CEO said we needed to find a CFO, and he wanted somebody from Harvard. And I'll give you one guess as to where the CEO went.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this CEO from Harvard said, yeah, we want to get somebody from Harvard. We need somebody smart, were his exact words. And if we lowered the bar far enough, he might accept somebody from Yale. And maybe Stanford is a distant third. And so that was clearly a filter. And one that was biasing this CEO very highly. So we asked the question for clarifying. So, Mr. CEO, if we find you a CFO who's taken wireless companies like yours through an S1 process and a successful public offering, you do not want to talk to them if they're not from Harvard. By phrasing it that way, what we discovered and what the CEO said, no, I definitely want to talk to them, but they wouldn't be from Harvard. So what it did is exposed his filter. He got it. He's from Harvard. He's a smart guy. So in the final analysis, we found him a CFO that he hired who had taken 3 companies like his public successfully, who was from, I think, Hayward, not Harvard. And he successfully accomplished it there. So this guy was a rock star for what he needed.
The other thing to be very careful about is the personal filter around experience, whether that's number of years of experience and or they work for these 1 or 2 competitors. Because even if they have experience, there's still A players with experience and there's C players with experience. So you really want to drill into their specific experience, their specific performance, getting to the eye. And I've seen a lot of, especially, once again, early career managers make this mistake a lot. Well, they work for this competitor, so I'm going to just talk to them because if they were there, they could really help our company. But what if they got fired, from their previous company at the competitor because they didn't perform?
What was their impact? That's exactly right. In fact, we see this frequently where people say, look, I want somebody from company A, B, or C only, our biggest competitors. Are you outselling them? Yes. Wait a minute. So you're outselling them and you want the people that you're beating? And so it's really important. What are the attributes you're seeking? And what are the common attributes of your current top performers? And when we get to the root of that, oftentimes we show and can highlight that those biases are actually working against them.
In fact, John, why don't you talk a little bit more about one of the techniques you have to get around your personal filters and your biases? And I think you call it, is it contradictory evidence?
Contrary evidence, that's right. So if the people on the webinar today walk away with nothing else other than being able to both understand and execute an interview with this contrary evidence strategy, this will be a success. So it goes something like this. No matter what your belief is about this person you're interviewing, question that belief and validate it with contrary evidence. So, for example, if I am impressed by your communication ability, this person's a phenomenal communicator. So that's my thesis. Mm-hmm. So I want to find out the contrary evidence. So the contrary evidence question might be, Ray, give me an example of where you didn't communicate particularly well. Because no one's completely one way or the other. The converse is also true. So interviewed somebody who I think doesn't have enough organizational skill to pull it off. Right? That's my thesis. And I have some things that this candidate said that gives me reason to believe that's probably accurate. But now I'm going to ask the contrary evidence question. Give me an example of where you were able to win the business because of your organizational skills, where others might have missed something. Mm-hmm. What you'll find is that people will surprise you. People that are not very communicative, right? So your assumption is that they don't communicate effectively well, and so I wouldn't hire them. And you ask them, give me an example of where you communicated particularly well. You will find that they're extraordinary in areas that you would never, ever have expected if you hadn't asked that question. One example, Lou Adler. Do you know Lou?
No, I don't.
Okay, so he's kind of the godfather of a lot of the online or the behavioral interviewing techniques. And he gives a story about a sales VP role he was supporting. And he interviewed somebody on the phone, was very impressed. This also speaks to filters. So he asked the guy to come and do an interview before he forwarded him on to the company executives. He said the guy walked in and he was huge. And his initial take was, this guy will never pass because his physical appearance is simply not going to fly with this client. So there's a huge filter, right? Mm-hmm. The other one was that he's just not going to have the energy to do it. So there's two filters. So he put that in the contrary evidence structure. So the way Lou tells it is he asks them questions about how you solve this, when did you run up against this, where were you most effective on your client presentations, your in-person client presentations, right? There's the contrary evidence. Lou says this VP of sales candidate got thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner during the course of that 1 hour interview.
Wow.
And so he forwarded him enthusiastically to the company. They hired him, and he was by far the best sales executive they'd ever had and was there for many, many years. So that's an example of where contrary evidence and understanding your filters made a huge difference.
Yeah, I know. In Silicon Valley, one of the big things people look for is, did you work for a company that shot to the moon or a company that crashed and burned? Well, so sometimes they look at crash and burn companies and say, oh, that's not been a very good person because the company wasn't successful. So often what I'll do is I'll say, well, let me find out about what I did, what he did in that company, what she did.
Get to the I.
Because it's a very common mistake. It's like, well, if you're at Google, you must have been great.
Right. Google hires people they fire. Don't kid yourself.
Exactly.
And hiring somebody who used to work at Google may be a huge mistake because you don't want to defer to their interviewing decisions as being the best ones for you.
So, John, I know we share a lot of information, so let's take a step back real quick and just summarize what we've said so far in today's webinar.
Sure. So the first thing is understand what you're looking for and use that to prepare for the interview. What needs to get done by when, how are you going to quantitatively measure the person's success to know you have a top performer, the person wants the job, and what are the attributes of your rock stars. One example is Monty Python. In one company, they would just have this real quirky culture around Monty Python.
So second thing, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So second thing is also to construct very effective interview questions.
That's
that
right.
Are behavior-based, that are open-ended, and even make sure that they challenge any filters that you have going in.
Right.
The other thing that's equally important is if you use team-based interviewing, make sure that every member of the interview team knows specifically what areas they're going to cover and what questions they're going to be using.
And when constructing those questions, it's a great point, also write out sort of a guideline of what the ideal response would look like.
Mm-hmm.
So you ask about how much you sold or what kinds of deal sizes. Say, we'd ideally like to see deal sizes in the XYZ range, contracts in the this value range.
Okay.
So then become aware of your biases. Now this is something where as you work with other people, you may even want to talk to them or each other about what you view as biases before the interview. Now, I know one about skiing.
What's that one?
Where the CEO and all the executive team members were professional or highly skilled downhill skiers, and I knew that anybody who was a competitive downhill skier would be looked at very seriously and probably hired independent of any other attribute. And so make sure that you and your team understand the biases. And finally,
conduct highly effective and consistent interviews. And that sounds like motherhood and apple pie. So just kind of give us an overview again. What does that really mean?
So the idea is that when they show up, you have an agenda, you have questions, you can be agile in the interview. You don't want to make it mechanical. So you want to be able to have your set questions, but also listen to the responses and use contrary evidence, understand your filters, and ultimately in following these techniques, you should be able to, in 40 minutes to 60 minutes, have a much better idea about whether to proceed with this person or not.
And one of the ways to do that very objectively and, quite frankly, legally is make sure you have a rating system. And if you do team-based interviewing, get the whole team to debrief and make sure that there's consistent perspective on that candidate across all members of the interview team.
One last thing is note-taking. Make sure you take notes. As Shakespeare once said, the faintest ink is better than the best memory. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll have a piece of paper or a tab underneath this or under the surface of the table so it's not obvious. And as you take notes, don't take notes as soon as they start speaking every time, because pretty soon that will become an element of making the candidate very uncomfortable. And you want them to relax so that they are more free-flowing with the information.
Okay, just a couple more slides, and we'll open it up to Q&A for the audience. So, John, I know one of the things that you're a big fan of is business reading, and you had some suggested reading for the audience today?
There are several great resources, but here are 4 that jump to the top of our list. One of the things I want to highlight is First Break All the Rules with Marcus Buckingham. I love this book because his basic premise is don't try to fill in where somebody's not strong by getting them trained to be where they're not strong. Yes, there's knowledge to be gleaned, but really look for those people with the innate talent to do the role you need done. And that's a really great epiphany. And, of course, do you know The Great Game of Business, right?
No, I'm not familiar with that book.
So the basic gist of it is tie to each person's role and ultimately their quarterly objective something that aligns with the P&L so they understand the impact they have to the company's revenue or earnings. It's a great foundational book that many businesses use.
In fact, it kind of goes to what we were talking about today. You should link back hiring managers' productivity in the interview process to their overall objectives and their performance towards
That's exactly
goals.
right. And those that are particularly good at interviewing, maybe even give them a bonus if they hire people who produce at a higher level or stay longer.
Yeah, great ideas. One of the things we like to do first is offer you the complimentary and free Acola interviewing and hiring guide. So you can send us an email.
Is it complimentary or is it free?
It's free and complimentary.
Okay.
It's free with our compliments.
And by the way, Ray, this guide is phenomenal. It has great question samples. It breaks it out in different categories. It's a really useful resource for not only the HR organization, but especially for the hiring managers and interview team members.
Yep. So please feel free to give us an email, and we'll send that to you right away.
So we have some questions.
Yeah, in fact, let's look at one of the first ones, and I think this is very interesting. Being a kind of an internet guy, I really like this. So virtual interviews. How do you interview remotely versus face-to-face?
So what's interesting, even as recently as 2 years ago, it would have been a bigger deal. But today, you're going to be hard-pressed to buy a device that connects to the internet that doesn't have a camera built into it. And that makes face-to-face interviewing via video, you can do it for free on things like Skype and Uvu, and you can do it from anywhere in the world, really.
In fact, one of the things we recommend, as we talked about, we provide the 2-level online interview for those open-ended behavioral-based questions we talked about. It might be really nice to have the hiring manager actually ask the questions via YouTube video, then ask the candidates to respond with their own YouTube video answering those questions.
It's great, and we've already seen that used in our platform very successfully and would recommend to others. Go ahead and ask a question via video, and to be able to accept someone's response, the only thing I'd guide people to is make sure you're clear about the time limit, because otherwise you get somebody's family home videos for 3 hours. Now, you may love spending your time that way, but probably not what you're looking for.
So here's a question, a little bit associated, and it's signed from, it's an old guy question. And he asked, do you know of any good resources for interviewing the me generation or Gen Y or whatever they are called? Essentially, anything that talks about what motivates the current generation of early career workforce.
You know, I'm laughing because my 20-year-old says that email is so 5 minutes ago. And it just highlights the nature of the immediate. I know people in their early 20s who don't even have email, right?
Well, if you looked at Facebook, they just recently issued a new email product. They don't call it email, they call it messages.
Messages, right, because it's IM is how a lot of these, the people of this generation communicate. And if I want to respond to you right then, I will. If I don't, I won't. And I'll never or rarely read my email. So the short answer is it goes back to understanding the people you're trying to find for the role. Right? We talked earlier, Ray, about how you craft the description in a way that's inherently compelling. Mm-hmm. And craft it in a way that's inherently compelling to the generation. Not that you're going to be discriminatory, but you know the sort of the style and the personalities of the people that are your top performers. Look at where they live, how they communicate, and try to bake that into it.
Yeah, the other thing you might want to think about in the interviewing process, the Y generation really isn't looking at what am I going to be doing from a career path over the next 20 years. What they're really interested in is what are the cool projects I'm going to be able to move from. So you might want to talk to them about how, for your first 6 months, this would be the key initiative you'd have underway. And based upon the performance there, then we'd give you a new initiative. Because, and if you look at Google, a lot of people, they rotate every 6 to 12 months to a new project.
So it's the work. And in fact, one of the most successful jobs we've recently launched that was able to get some of the Gen Y engaged, you know what the title was?
No.
It was Kangaroo Trainer.
I don't get it.
And then we went on to say Lion Tamer, Zebra Rider. And then we said, frankly, we don't care what you've done. We want people who are driven, who want to do other things, and we got phenomenal response. Another one was Intern. The title was Intern - Overworked and Underpaid. And again, a little bit of humor, focus on the job and the work, not necessarily having this career path as a primary, and you'll oftentimes see a much better response if that's the target audience.
We have another question that is somewhat related, and it's about how do you recommend evaluating new grads or people looking to switch industries where their experience may not directly relate, but they have transferable skills?
Well, this goes back to getting to how the people are wired sort of at a basic point. We talked about drive, curiosity, and ethics. And if somebody's right out of a school, or a new graduate, or there's somebody switching careers, as long as the role can accommodate somebody who doesn't have the functional knowledge, then it becomes very clear, focus on those three attributes. Their drive is going to manifest itself even in school. Did they head projects? Were they working? Were they the people who were the team leads? These are the people who were the people in the dormitories, who managed the floor. So there's a variety of leadership roles that one can play. Were they captain of an athletic team?
And you might look at somebody who's transferred their skills before. An example, someone who worked as a waiter during their college years, and then they became an inside salesperson for a couple of years. Once again, sales and waiter, is it in common? No. But they're very similar skills which are transferable.
That's right. And you know who's going to be hosting the next party.
Exactly. So let's look at a couple more questions here. So this one's a very interesting one. Time. John, how long should an interview last to be effective?
Well, this relates to another question that somebody asked about how to respond to a hiring manager that says, I make a hiring decision within the first 30 seconds. So it's safe to say that an interview that lasts 30 seconds is too short.
And it might be based upon some personal filters and biases.
That's right. And it doesn't mean you don't have a thesis or an assumption, but you still need to test it. The other thing is that the interview time has to think about the relationship with the person, not just are they a fit for the job, but you want every single person who interviews to walk away from you and the company enthusiastically. So what we recommend is, even if you know they're not a fit, relatively early in the discussion, it should go at least 20, 25, 30 minutes so that you can respect them and the fact they made the effort to show up. Now, this is for in-person interviews. In some cases, phone interviews, you have a little more leeway.
And at what point would you say the interview is getting too long?
Typically, if it's a face-to-face, if it's lasting more, for this a straight up interview, no demos, no, code walkthroughs or assessments, if it gets longer than about 50 or 60 minutes, it's probably too long.
Okay. Well, we have one other question that kind of relates to the hiring manager who makes his decisions in 30 seconds, and that is, how do we break hiring managers of their bad habits, such as always hiring people like them?
Well, it's human nature, isn't it? If you went to Ohio State and you want to keep the bar relatively low, you hire other Ohio State grads. It's just a common thing.
Ouch.
Okay, you want to raise the bar. Okay. But I think
we typically close the bar at IC.
Okay, yeah. I wasn't going to go there. So the idea is that people feel most comfortable generally with others who are like them. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, that can be a good thing as long as it's clear that those alignment points don't exclude others. Does that make sense?
It does. In fact, we have one other question that is a little bit linked again. I like these questions that are linked, and it's around personality assessments.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you feel about personality assessments that companies give?
So,
because that was, if you're looking at high-performing people, and you do an assessment, it's probably going to look like the people they want to hire.
Well, it's interesting about personality assessments. There's definitely a place for them, and I suspect, like you, I've taken dozens of these, and they have been remarkably similar in terms of the results.
And as soon as you pass one, you stop?
Exactly. Took me a while to get that, Ray. That's exactly right. So assessments, if they worked absolutely, we would simply do an assessment and then make a hiring decision based on that. The fact that assessments are not used that way is another indicator that it is not an end-all. It will never be an end-all, just like the interview isn't necessarily an end-all. So I look at the assessments as another data point to confirm a thesis of either a fit or maybe not as strong a fit, or if you made the decision to hire the person, how to manage them.
Yeah. Right? And I think we also find that there's certain industries and certain roles where they might be more beneficial. An example, if you have a large inside sales organization and you're bringing early career professionals,
right,
you might want to look at those attributes and innate personality traits of the high performers and, quite frankly, some of the lowest performers. and as a final step in the interview and decisioning process, map those final candidates against that. Same with customer service. You might find that you're looking for people who have a need to build more personal relationships,
Right.
to be a little bit more intimate with each other. That might be a great fit and assessment to look for customer service reps.
Well, in fact, in Bank of America, we use something called the Berger, B-E-R-G-E-R aptitude test. It was actually remarkably accurate for deciphering whether somebody had programming talent, even if they'd never programmed a line of code in their life.
Interesting.
And it was remarkably accurate. Now, there were other things that went around this, but we hired people who were transformative to that organization. Here's one for you, Ray. So full-time versus contractor. So how do you differentiate interviews for full-time people versus contractors?
Well, you can use a lot of the basic principles we talked about today, but one of the things we've noticed is when you look at, let's say, a contract employee where they have a definitive amount of time for their project, maybe it's 90 days, you may not rely as heavily upon some of the cultural alignment aspects of the interview process. You're looking more for specific functional experience and similar project experience where they can come in, get things done quickly, and move on.
Right.
Where if it's a full-time position, you really want to look at not only the behavioral-based experience, but also the cultural alignment and the personality alignment.
It makes sense. It makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, so we have a couple more here that we want to talk about. One of those is around new versus experience. Please discuss the trade-off between hiring a newbie and training them in your style versus hiring an experienced person and needing to reshape them to your own methods.
This is a great question. And I'm thinking about even in the context of Acolo, where we've hired some very experienced recruiters and tried to retrain them to be hiring consultants. Very difficult. And in some ways, we were able to take relatively junior people who had much better writing skills, more consultative talent, which is what the hiring consultants need, and it made a world of difference. So I think the way you need to look at that is situational, right? And if you're in a business that is like another business but maybe transformative or different enough, it may be easier to hire someone who doesn't come with all these preconceived notions and habits.
Also, I think this can almost be a false trade-off because we talked about curiosity. If you get a very experienced person who has shown that they have a continuous desire to be curious, to learn, to try new things, they may be a great person to come into your organization even though they're going to have to do things differently.
Right.
But you got to go back to that drive, curiosity, and ethics. Look at their curiosity and the proven ability to change.
Right. Because if they can't, then you're going to have a real problem on your hands.
Exactly. I mean, I came into Acolo. I've never been in, quote unquote, the recruiting industry, but I love learning. So I've learned so much in the last year. And
you're doing fantastic things.
Yeah, well, how have I done that if I've learned
So we've got the last three questions, Ray. The first one's around salary. So where does salary place in terms of people leaving one job for another?
Believe it or not, most of the surveys say it's not the predominant reason people will leave. They're really looking at job satisfaction. Are they being valued in the organization? And what is the growth and learning opportunities?
Which also relates directly to how they're being managed and the manager style.
Exactly. So when we're talking today about how to conduct a perfect interview training, and that's really geared a lot towards hiring managers, but at the same time, you need to give hiring managers leadership development all the time. This is an interesting topic, especially with all the federal stimulus money still out there yet to be spent. And that is, do you have any insight into the OFCCP regulations?
Sure. In fact, we were, and we're periodically get asked by the OFCCP and the EEOC to sort of educate them on modern recruiting techniques, and they actually look at what we do as being some of the most legally defensible. So what's interesting about OFCCP regulations, if you don't know this, it's Office of Federal Contractor Compliance. And what they're looking to do and what they do require if you work with the federal government is that there's absolute accurate tracking in who gets to a certain level of the interview process and who gets hired versus who doesn't get hired from that point. So minimally qualified would be those that meet the threshold, typically are in the phone screen category. And best qualified, obviously, are final interviews or ultimately hired. Now, what's interesting with the Internet is now you can actually exceed OFCCP and EEOC data collection reporting if you have a mechanism or a platform that collects the data right up front, and then you get it at each stage throughout the entire process, broken down both by race and by stage.
Interesting. I think we have one question remaining, and it's talking. The question is, what other avenues do you suggest to flush out a candidate's personal drive or ability? As an example, we have sales candidates do a presentation as part of the process. Are there other exercises that can give you a more complete picture of a candidate?
Oh, absolutely. So it goes back to having the predetermined behavioral-based questions that speak to their drive in all other aspects of their life. Right? You're not going to find somebody who never did anything extraordinary. Their idea of drive is, going to the refrigerator to get another beer. There's no way that you're going to get that person to somehow turn into an Olympic-style competitive person. It just won't happen.
Here's a really interesting technique that I used at a previous company, and that is you ask a candidate, if we gave you $1 million, how would you invest it in our business?
Well, that's interesting, because they would have had to also study the business model enough.
They'd have to understand the business. They'd have to have some curiosity, and you'd see what type of drive they have. Is it a personal drive to have success for their own career growth, or is it really how I think really the company could really perform with $1 million of additional capital?
And I think it's also important to differentiate between drive and ability. So, for example, somebody could be highly driven, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have the communication ability. One of the things that we look for example, in salespeople is we have a business where we want to build long-term relationships with prospects, and that's how we get business to increase over time. So one of the things we look for is how many birthday, holiday cards do you send out every year? So it's a proxy for somebody who values connection and makes a point of reaching out to people.
I'm glad I had a big family.
Exactly.
I passed that test.
Yes, you did.
Okay. Well, I think that's the end of the Q&A for today. So I want to thank the audience for attending today's How to Conduct the Perfect Interview webinar. And we will also have this on our website. Thank you very much. John, thanks for attending today.
Thanks, Ray, and fantastic job.
Good hiring, everyone.